Is the moon hiding a hollow core, one with an advanced civilization? If anyone did not believe our moon might be hollow, it was UFO investigator and author Rob Shelsky. However, after researching the facts, the author did something he rarely does. He made a complete about-face on his views regarding the hollow Earth theory. Just why did he do this? For a good reason, because the evidence to support the idea of our moon being hollow was far greater than he had ever suspected. Who is Rob Shelsky? Rob is an avid and eclectic writer of both fiction and nonfiction. Rob, with a degree in science, has written a large number of factual articles for the former Alien Skin magazine, as well as many others. With over 20 years of research and investigative efforts behind him, Rob is well qualified in the subject of UFOs. As a skeptic, he likes to kick the tires surrounding UFO phenomena and enjoys asking the hard questions others seem to avoid in search for possible, yet convincing answers to these ongoing enigmas. Hi, and welcome to Just Energy. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and today we're going to be speaking with Rob about his book, The Moon is Hollow and Aliens Rule the Sky. So please welcome Rob Shelsky. Hi, Rob, and welcome to Just Energy. How are you doing today?
Okay, Dr. Rita, thank you for having me on your show.
Well, I think the nature of your book is going to be something really interesting because there is just so much controversy around the moon. Is it hollow? Do we have bases on there? I mean, there's just so much going on. But let's start here. What first turned your attention to looking at the moon?
Well, there was a lot of stuff that slowly came to a head with it because I've been a MUFON field investigator for quite a while with UFOs. And everything I saw and everything I read seemed to point towards the moon being a problem. And then one day I was being interviewed on another radio show and someone asked me, called in and said, "Do you think the moon is hollow?" And I said, I laughed. I said, "No, of course not." And, and it's not made of Swiss cheese either. But then I started looking into it. I don't know why, I just did. And I began to realize there's a lot of problems with the moon. I mean, big ones. Of all the objects in our solar system, it's the moon that is the hardest to understand, and yet it's the closest to us.
Okay, so what's so weird about it? I mean, kind of in more of a general sense of the word.
Well, you might be better to ask what's not weird about it, because there's that much wrong with it.
Wow.
The moon is oversized. We have the largest moon in the solar system for any terrestrial planet, meaning a rocky planet. The moon is not dense enough. It's too light for its size. And its orbit is very strange. It's too circular. There's only one other object in the solar system with a more circular orbit, and I believe that's Venus. And there's quite a bit else wrong with it too, but we can get into that a little later if you like.
Well, and I've heard people suggest that the moon's hollow, but what kind of there to support that? I mean, it just seems pretty far out there to make that suggestion.
Yes, it does. And actually, I didn't come up with the idea. Two Soviet scientists in the Soviet Academy of Sciences originally came up with the idea of the spaceship moon. And I believe one was Mikhail Vasilin, and the other one was Sherbakov. And it was their idea that the moon might be hollow for a number of reasons. For one thing, none of our theories about the moon's origin seem to work. There have been 5 major theories about the moon, and all of them have problems, including the very latest ones.
The one where there was some external body that crashed into the Earth, and then that chunk became the moon?
Right, that would be the Theia theory. Sounds like I'm lisping, I know. But supposedly a planet Mars-like in size, or a little less, Theia, they call it that, crashed into the Earth early on, and they sort of blew mostly apart and then coalesced together. And the moon was formed out of the remnants of that explosion. There are problems with this theory because, number one, the material on the moon doesn't seem to have any of the Theia material in it. Moon rocks brought back from around the surface of the moon show no evidence of the planet Theia being part of the moon.
But how would we know what Theia material would be or look like?
The radioactive isotopes of the moon and any object in the solar system are highly unique. Rocks, meteors from Mars have their own signature. From the moon, they have theirs. From well, any planet, and they're all different. Even the asteroids are all different. So it would have to have had some rocks on the moon that would have had a different isotopic signature from those on Earth. We don't have any that are different from the mantle of the Earth's surface. There's a problem with that. Again, the moon's orbit's too circular, and we can't account for it. The first of the creation theories of the moon said that it was simply captured. It seems unlikely. More likely, if the moon had come hurtling towards the Earth or even near it, one or two of the objects would have been thrown out of the solar system into wildly eccentric orbits. That's not the case, as we know. Secondly, the moon shouldn't have such a circular orbit. And thirdly, it shouldn't have stopped around the Earth, but it should have kept on going because of its speed, unless the Earth had a much larger atmosphere sticking further out into space to act as a brake. Well, we have no evidence for this either. So it goes and continues to go. There just doesn't seem to be any real explanation of how the moon got here. Darwin thought it might have come from the Earth. The Pacific Basin might have been the source of the moon. Well, we know that's not true because we've tested the rock material there. Another idea was that the moon might have been a georeactor. This is the newest theory, that there was a lot of radioactive material in the Earth's crust right near the equator, and this somehow ignited like a giant nuclear explosion, and part of the Earth just blew up into space. This theory came about just in the last couple of years because the Theia theory has its own problems.
Well, when we look at the moon material, does it have an Earth signature to it, or is it completely different from that also?
It does have an Earth signature to it, but it has some very strange anomalies as well. For instance, neptunium, which is a mildly radioactive isotope, has a half-life of about a little less than 3 years. I think it's 2.2 or 2.7, somewhere in there. But if you go by that, there should be no neptunium left on Earth after 4.5 billion years, because every 3 million years or so, you've got half of what you had before. So over 4.5 billion years, there should be none left. Well, the moon has a good deal of neptunium. Earth has none. We can't understand how that could be. The Earth has a lot of helium-3. The Earth has virtually none. In fact, there's so much helium-3 on the moon, it would be great to mine because it's the perfect fuel for fusion reactors, which is another oddity. The craters on the moon, the big ones are shallow and the small ones are deep. According to the spaceship moon theory, this would be so if there was an inner core of steel or some kind of metal. And because when a meteor would impact the moon, it would travel deep into the moon the bigger the meteor was and the faster it was going. Fortunately, the large craters are very shallow, as if the meteors hit something solid below the surface. The shallow ones, which wouldn't go in very deep, are deep because they didn't travel that far. So again, we have a lot of problems with that as well.
That's just really interesting. And I've never heard the information presented in this way. So this is good. Well, you know, people will put out, oh, well, it's hollow. I mean, the only thing that I've heard as supportive information to the whole notion was the concept that they sent a signal to it, they blasted a nuke at it, and they heard kind of a bell-like sound come off of it. And that's the only piece of data that I have ever heard anybody put forward to potentially support a hollow moon.
Well, actually, no one's ever nuked the moon, thank God. But you're right, they did impact the moon with a satellite to see what would happen. But what we found was that every time we did something on the moon would ring like a bell. And when I mean ring like a bell, it rang for a long time, sometimes hours in length. And noted scientists said, we can't understand this unless the moon is hollow. Because when Apollo 11 took off from the moon, they left seismometers on the moon, and these things registered the moon vibrating for well over half an hour or so. In other instances, this rang even longer. And here's another weird thing. That vibration doesn't seem to travel through the center. It travels around it as if there was nothing in the center, which is strange as well. But we can't account for it. One scientist, a physicist, said it was as if the moon has giant shock absorbers somehow in it that's allowing it to do this. There's another problem with the moon. The moon, the center of the moon, the center of gravity of the moon isn't where it should be. It's several miles away from the center, and they can't account for that either. And again, we have the problem of the density of the moon. For an object that size, made of Earth-like material, it should be denser. It should have more pull on the Earth. It doesn't. Thinking that one through, are we?
Yes, we're thinking that one through. But can a planet be hollow? I mean, like, there are people that say hollow Earth theory, and I believe that there are big caverns within the Earth and definitely hollow spots. But it sounds like what you're talking about is kind of like a giant round egg that's hanging out in our sky and not just caverns.
Well, actually, I'm of two minds about that. The two Soviet scientists felt that there was a core about 25 miles down and about 25 miles down and quite thick, like 20 or so miles thick of solid metal, maybe titanium. By the way, we have a lot of titanium on the moon too, which we don't have on Earth. And that's another strange anomaly as well. And this inner shell would act as the outer for a hollow center. I'm not sure if the moon is entirely hollow. It may have large lava tubes and caverns in there, but it would have to have very many to account for the lack of density that it has. And so, yes, it could be empty in the center, hollow, or it could be a lot of huge caverns.
But if it doesn't have as much density, why doesn't it actually end up getting pulled toward the Earth because of the gravity?
Well, actually, the reverse would be true. If the moon had more density, had more mass, the Earth and the moon would be more attracted to each other. Larger objects have more of a gravity pull than light ones. So, and the moon is actually moving away from the Earth ever so slowly. I think it's about an inch a year or so, and which means at one time it should have been much closer, though we have no evidence for that either. There should have been some kind of symptoms, characteristics of the moon having been very close to the Earth at one time. We don't have that. No evidence for that. The moon is at a very funny place in the sky. Of all the satellites in the solar system, all the moons around all the planets, only our moon is situated at such a point that it makes for a perfect total eclipse. It also has the perfect solstices and equinoxes, the same as the sun. We're the only moon that has that, and we also have, again, the largest moon of any terrestrial planet in the solar system.
And you don't think that some of that is just our interpretation of what we're seeing, or us trying to lay our beliefs over a situation as far as especially the solstices and equinox?
Well, yes, I think you can take any one piece of evidence and say, well, it's just a coincidence. But when you start putting all the pieces together and you have coincidence after coincidence, then you have to wonder if something else isn't going on here. I mean, we have the idea that the moon rings like a bell. We have titanium on the moon. We have neptunium on the moon. We have helium-3 on the moon, which we don't have on Earth. We have no evidence of Theia being part of the moon. The moon's orbit is too circular by far. Orbits are naturally slightly elliptical, and the moon's is just a little too circular for that. The moon's situated at such a point in the sky that the equinoxes, the solstices, and it's perfect for total eclipses. Now you start adding all that together, and you have to start wondering, what's going on?
Well, what about the notion, and I've heard people talk about this, that it's actually a spaceship?
Well, that's the spaceship theory. The two Soviet scientists who in the late 70s came up with this theory felt that the moon had been moved into orbit around Earth. And of all 5 theories that we currently have for the origin of the moon, the spaceship moon theory is the only one that answers every single problem we have with the moon. It accounts for everything. All the other theories of the moon, by all the cosmologists, all the astronomers, have major problems with them.
So you're not saying it was aliens, but it's aliens.
Yeah, I'm saying it's aliens. It wasn't us, unless we had a civilization long ago that was capable of such a thing, you know.
Seems like anywhere you look, in the natural world, in the mythic record, you know, now you're throwing the moon on top of this pile. The easiest explanation for what's going on is it was God who made it perfect for mankind, you know, or extraterrestrials, and I see those terms being pretty
Interchangeable.
interchangeable. Correct. A matter of
Yes,
semantics.
it is a matter of semantics, but there is one major difference. If it's God who did all this for us, and it would be nice to think it was, then he should have done a better job because there are some major problems with the moon. It's like he whoopsed up there a couple of times. And if it is aliens, then we have another problem. What are they doing here? Why are they here? And what are their motivations and goals?
When we look at the moon, I mean, it's not habitable or human life, but do you think that there could have been life on that planet that could exist in whatever atmosphere is there?
There's almost virtually no atmosphere on the moon. It's the nearest thing we have to a perfect vacuum without quite being a vacuum. Even the exhaust of the Apollo missions significantly added to the atmosphere of the moon because it was so close to zero to begin with. So, I mean, even if you put a little bit of emptied in one oxygen tank on the moon, that gives it more of an atmosphere than it had before that one oxygen tank. So, quite a bit more. But no, the moon has no atmosphere. Whoever's on the moon or has been on the moon has to have been protected underground. And again, we have that spaceship moon theory. And we also have all that transient lunar phenomena or translunar phenomena that's been going on for 6 centuries at least, and actually a lot longer, but NASA only reported on it for the last 5 centuries or so. And that is significant too because it shows whatever is happening on the moon has been happening for a very long time.
Okay, so what's been happening? What's this translunar
everything.
phenomena?
Everything.
Well, like
Ever
what?
the NASA issued its own report on this, and it's public domain. You can look it up on the internet. And basically, what they did was they had researchers compile reports of anything that was seen on the moon over the last, well, almost 5 centuries. And that's about the time when the telescope became popular, and that's why they used that period. And the thing is, they came up with an incredible amount. And these aren't just fly-by-night observers we're talking about. We're talking about mainstream astronomers. We're talking about Tycho Brahe, Copernicus, all sorts of astronomers that are lauded in astronomy as the fathers of astronomy. And they found everything on the moon you can imagine. They have seen blinking lights. They have seen flashes. They have seen streaks. They have seen tracks, they have seen trails, they have seen mists, they have seen vapors, they have seen what they thought were volcanoes. Well, there are no volcanoes, at least not active ones on the moon. In fact, most cosmologists and astronomers don't think the moon has had active volcanoes for tens of millions of years, probably. So what we are seeing on the moon is unaccounted for because it has no atmosphere. They see lightning streaks. No atmosphere, no lightning. They see flashes, they see flares, they see moving, pulsing lights across the surface of the moon. What are these things?
Into your imagination, obviously.
That Tycho Brahes and Copernicus and Galileos as well.
That's right. That's right. Are there any other planets that don't have an atmosphere? I mean, we know like Jupiter has the sphere, Mars has atmosphere. It seems like most of the ones that we look at, except for maybe Mercury because it's too friggin' hot, have atmospheres.
Right, but a lot of satellites don't. And, well, I won't say a lot, but a number don't. And the moon happens to be one of them. It is a bit odd it has no atmosphere at all. It's not that small where it shouldn't have some kind of an atmosphere, but it had it all. Other moons, depending on how you want to pronounce it, whether you want to do the Greek or the modern language, Deimos and Phobos or Deimos and Phobos of Mars have no atmospheres. They're very small. They're hardly larger than asteroids. But we used to think they were asteroids caught by Mars, and now we're not so sure. We don't think they might be. In fact, Phobos might be hollow as well. It might be the other hollow moon. And isn't it strange that there might be a hollow moon orbiting the only other planet in the solar system that might have once held life?
That is interesting. Is it in a circular orbit?
No, it's in a very strange orbit. In fact, we cannot account for its orbit. The orbit is very retrograde. To many astronomers, it always looked like it speeded up and slowed down, but it's because of its strange orbit. And also, there's sort of a monolith on one end of it, and its density is too low, way too low, and so scientists wonder if it isn't hollow too.
So you had to mention Monolith. Now I'm automatically in my mind going to 2001: A Space Odyssey and the Monolith on there.
So am I.
Do you think that based on what they've looked at on the moon, that there ever could have been life or the precursors of life on that planet? Or does it just seem dead, 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 dead?
I think it's always been a dead world, at least on the surface. I think the lack of an atmosphere, there was heavy bombardment. By the way, that's another oddity about the moon. I keep giving you these oddities. The side facing us has what they call mares on them. It's Latin for seas. And they are big, large, flat areas. Look up at the moon at night and you'll see these like dull, gray, dark areas on the moon. These are these so-called huge lava beds. Mm-hmm. Now, the odd part is on the far side of the moon, there are none. Absolutely none. It's all craters, nothing else but craters.
But that's one of the other things that's weird about the moon is that it doesn't rotate. And so when we talk about the dark side of the moon, it's dark because we can't see it because it never turns to face the Earth.
No, it doesn't. The moon does have a night and day. I mean, there's no such thing as a dark side of the moon, of course. That's Pink Floyd. But the moon night and day on both sides, and that one night and day takes a total of 1 month or 1 month. And so there's 14 days of light and dark on the moon on each side. On the dark side, we can see about, I don't know, about 62 to 65% because the moon wobbles a little, has what they call libration. So we can, if we watch it long enough with our telescopes, we can pick up about that much of it. But there's a large area we just cannot see, except by sending rockets there and or putting satellites in orbit around it.
Recently, the Chinese sent up expeditions to map out the moon or take some high-res images of the moon. Have you seen any of the data that's come out of that research?
There wasn't a lot. The rover they put on the moon stopped functioning not long after they put it there, and most of the data, what data we were allowed to see that was made public by the Chinese, was pretty much run-of-the-mill, but then it hadn't landed on the far side of the moon. So, of course, we're going to get the same data that our own Apollo got for us as well.
And see, I thought they mapped out from space. I didn't realize, I mean, I knew they put a rover down there, but I thought they also did aerial imaging of the moon. No?
Yes, they have done aerial imaging of the moon, and now we're getting into the problems with NASA and all these where it looks like things have been airbrushed out. I myself have tried to find the original high-resolution photos from NASA of the moon, and they had a site where they had them in high definition. They removed those. We now only have lower medium definition, and you cannot blow those up enough to see. Now, I did manage to find some on another site that were put there before these were removed, and these do show these strange objects on the moon, especially the far side.
Well, and I've talked to Mike Barr in the past about alien bases on the moon. It sounds like you've uncovered similar types of things on the surface.
Very much, and I do base a lot of my research on other people's research as well that I find that's reliable. One can't do it all from scratch, although I do verify and try to find at least 3 sources independent of each other to verify that something is true. I don't go by just what one person says, and I do try to find the original sources. I have applied for freedom of information material. What little I did get was almost entirely redacted. Not much help. So I'm not quite sure if that was of any use at all, but the evidence seems to show that there are ruins on the moon, maybe of mining camps or something else, and some of them look inactive, and there's a couple that look like they might still be active.
And these are on the dark side of the moon?
The far side of the
far side.
Yes, ma'am, they are.
The side that we can't see. You know, it just might be a whole NASA conspiracy. They don't want the moon to turn so that we can't see the back.
Yes, we might call that another oddity too, but that's probably the result of tidal forces between the Earth and the moon locking towards the Earth. That would be natural. We can account for that. You see, I don't take everything that's an oddity as being a sign of something. I do try to discount it first.
Can you give some examples of what kinds of things, these anomalies that you've seen? on the
Well,
moon?
there's quite a few. There's one that looked like a bridge in an original photo, actually two photos taken by two different astronomers of the moon. It's now disappeared. There was something that looked like a square fortress, and I know this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but we were talking about that impact of a satellite earlier to see what dust would be, what atmosphere, if there might be some water vapor. Granted, there should have been some ice, and they hoped it would go up in the form of water vapor. But it also happened to be the very area where that so-called fortress was, and it's not there anymore. There looks like what was a giant shattered dome. There is an area that they refer to as the LA Basin because it looks like blocks and blocks of buildings like you would have seen if you looked down on the LA Basin, and these run in such straight lines that it's unaccountable. There are grooves in the ground that make right-angle turns. Now, scientists said, oh, this was probably lava flows. Well, lava flows don't make right-angle turns. It flows very much like water. It takes the path of least resistance. But in nature, you rarely see straight lines in right-angle turns. These do this. And how these tracks and grooves were formed, we're not sure. There's also something called the spire, which is something that just towers into the sky and looks like it might be huge. There has been video of what looked like gas venting from the moon from what looks almost like a steeple or chimney at one point. So there's quite a bit on the moon by the looks of it.
What do you think? I mean, we're going to go to break here in a second, but what do you think about the whole notion that we've actually never been to the moon and that the astronaut footage that we do have was filmed by Stanley Kubrick somewhere and fed to the American public?
I think that's ridiculous, personally. But then I thought the hollow moon theory was too at one time. But you know, they broadcast from the moon. The NASA did, and these were on open channels much of the time. And ham operators at the time, in the late '60s and early '70s, were quite capable of picking these signals up, as were other countries like China and Russia, and they could triangulate. And they came from the moon. Plus, they left stuff being the seismographs and the and other recording devices that we are getting telemetry from. So it would seem and a reflective mirror, and it would seem highly unlikely that that just appeared on the moon by magic. Someone had to put it there.
Well, they could have just sent something up. I mean, I think that, you know, we've sent stuff there, you know, but there's the whole issue with the Van Allen belt, creating a space where, you know, we as organic beings just can't get through it.
Well, the Van Allen belt is a radiation belt, yes, naturally, but they're well shielded, and yes, they do suffer damage. So do the astronauts on board Skylab, or the International Space Station, and there is a problem with that, especially if it's at the time of a solar flare. But we have adequate protection to get people to the moon and back. Massive solar flare occurring sometime during the transition. Astronauts would have been in extreme danger if that had occurred on Apollo missions. They were really very lucky in that regard.
We're talking to Rob Shelsky about his book, The Moon is Hollow and Aliens Rule the Sky. Rob, you were talking about different craters and how, or that lava flow surface that just seems so anomalous. Do you have any explanation as to how that could have even formed?
Yes, and it actually isn't mine. It's, again, from those two Soviet scientists. Their theory was that someone took the moon and pumped out the interior magma of the moon. This would account for all those massive lava fields you can see from Earth with the naked eye. And also, apparently, they didn't do it evenly around the moon. They only did it on our side of the moon. Now, there's another oddity about the moon. The far side of the moon's crust is thicker than the near side. Again, these oddities just keep piling up. I don't know how there could be that many. One would have thought.
Well, maybe they needed to balance it out like your tire, where you put the little metal things on the rim to make sure it's going in around.
So we spin well. You know, that well could be, because when you're with something that large, you've got to be careful with what you're doing. They're basically terraforming the moon, not to make it Earth-like, but to make it suit their needs, if this is the case. Oh, there's another oddity about the moon I thought I should mention, too. We have meteorites that fall from the moon and from Mars. Again, we know where they're from because of the isotopic signature of these meteorites. The moon, supposedly, if it's been in orbit around the Earth for 4.5 billion years, we should have a heck of a lot of moon rocks on the Earth, meteorites. And Mars, the moon is about 250,000 miles away. Mars is on average, because it gets closer and further, but it's around 62 to 65 million miles away. That's a vast difference in scale. And yet the number of meteorites we've found on Earth so far to date are equal. The Martian meteorites are about the same as the lunar meteorites we found. And this is very strange because we can't account for this. If the moon's been up there and that close to the Earth for all that time, we should have a lot more from the moon than we have from Mars, but we don't.
But is it normal for planets to give off debris like that?
During the molting season, yeah. No, I'm kidding. They all all planets have impact asteroids. And when that happens, a great deal of material shoots up into the skies, and the smaller the planet, the less it's able to capture that material, and some of it escapes and goes into space. It may stay in space for millions of years, but eventually some of it does make its way to Earth and falls here. That's how we get the meteorites from Mars and the Moon. And it seems to work pretty well, although it takes quite a while.
So in saying is that somewhere at some point in time, some other planet might get like a piece of array off of one of our satellites?
Well, if the satellite was damaged by a meteorite and smashed to bits by a high-speed meteorite, yes, parts would go flying off, and eventually some of them might land up on another planet. Yes, absolutely.
Well, that's kind of an interesting thought.
Well, it would take millions of years, so we probably wouldn't care one way or the other if it did. You're getting our space debris, but we're dead and gone. So.
No, we're going to be highly intelligent, advanced civilizations capable of interstellar travel, just like Star Trek. Come on.
Good luck with that. It's interesting you mentioned Star Trek was such a positive, uplifting show, and I used to love to watch it. And then have you noticed all the science fiction shows got very dark, gloomy? Scenes
It's
are
not
wet,
just
drippy.
science fiction; it's across the board
It
in
is.
genre.
It is horror. All of it is all dark and drippy scenes. Almost all takes place at night, and it all is very negative. I don't understand. In the '60s, we were so forward-thinking, and now it's almost like we're afraid of our own shadows. Maybe we should be. I don't know.
But then there's the whole sociological part of it, where this is something that we're being. And so in the 60s, everybody wanted to have their communication device or a tricorder or, one of the little tablets that you could write on, and we created it.
Yes, we did. And it's funny. We had a heck of a positive attitude in our sci-fi shows. The future always seemed brighter. And that was in the 60s and 70s. And that was during the height of the Cold War period, when we should have all been living under the mushroom cloud and fearing everything and being in dread of being annihilated at any instant. Now, with the Cold War removed, all of a sudden we're into this dark, deep, almost depressive state. It's really strange. Sociologically, it doesn't make sense.
Well, unless you have to give people something to be afraid of.
Well, that's your point, and I have to agree with it because it wouldn't be a normal situation. It somehow has to have been created, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, back to the moon. Bam! Right to the moon. Anyway,
quick trip.
Oh, I thought that was crazy. That was a quick trip. Anyway, so if there are extraterrestrials on the moon, or if this was a base at one point in time on the moon, who do you think was occupying these facilities?
Well, of course, now we're getting into the realm of speculation, but we do have some evidence that would tend to tell us why, how, and when. And it was in my second book, For the Moon is Hollow, and Aliens Rule the Sky, that I really began to try to fix a date and time. Not a precise date. There's one man who actually did. I don't know how he came up with the exact date. I couldn't. But it may be that there was more than one race. It may be that the moon, and this comes more from my second book, is a type of Death Star. It may have been that there was one heck of an interstellar war a long time ago, and the moon was used as the high ground. It was put into orbit to seize control of the Earth.
I'm not going to argue with you on that conjecture at all, because I have not about the moon and its role, but about there being, battle for Earth. Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree.
And we do have evidence from different sources, such as the Vedic texts of the Hindus, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. We also, where it talks specifically about almost 500 species. It talks about space travel. It talks about multiple planets. It talks about a great battle taking place in the space, between the stars. And it even refers to a battle that took place on the moon. And I believe it was Krishna who flew from the Earth in his Vimana to the moon. These Vimanas were flying vehicles that the Hindus claimed existed at one time, and they were very specific in detail about these Vimanas. There is even a manual, pages and pages of long, of how they were constructed and how they worked, and also how the pilots were to fly them. Apparently, human pilots were allowed to fly them at times, and there's like a manual on how they were to fly without colliding with other Vimanas. I guess we weren't too good at it.
But even in some of those mythic narratives, when the gods or the children of the gods were learning to fly them, it was kind of like your kids getting in the car for the first time. It's like, okay, I'm going to go in the house so you don't run me over. And there were these narratives that talked about they were not scared, but they were watching to make sure that they didn't crash into anything. So I think that was a fairly common practice, even in ancient times.
Yes, and if we weren't pictures of Vimanas, it may account for the craters on the moon.
So in that, there are so many people that run around, Anunnaki, Anunnaki, Anunnaki. Do you think it was the Anunnaki? Do you think that the word Anunnaki is just being used in a generic kind of way to represent alien races in general? What's your thought?
I have two minds about that. I do think the Anunnaki existed. I think it's what the Sumerians referred to them as. And I do think that they were here on Earth. I do think they were overlords. And in my book, I delve into that quite a bit because I get into the pre-Adamite culture of Earth, pre-flood. And I do think, but I don't think they were the only ones. And I do think we might have been created. There's some interesting information, not necessarily created, but genetically manipulated to serve them. If the Anunnaki existed and they had the priesthood serving them, the priesthood literally served them. In fact, they waited on them hand and foot, fed them, brought them their food, clothed them, kept their palaces clean or temples. Now today, our religions still have the temples, and we still have the priesthood serving the gods, but the gods seem to have vacated, unless, of course, one believes in the Almighty God, and in which case there's a reason to do it still.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going off on a big old tangent that I could just talk on and on and on about. But, okay, so there seems to be, in your opinion, evidence of structures on the moon. Do you think that these are still being occupied? Do you think there's an active presence there?
I think there's an active presence on the moon, or at least intermittently there's an active presence on the moon. Again, the translunar phenomena that NASA had the report issued on didn't stop. It's still going on. We're still seeing these things on the moon. And I can't stress this enough. The moon is supposedly a dead world. It has no atmosphere. It has nothing to create any of these things. You might see an occasional flash from an asteroid impact, but you wouldn't see streaks. Streaks only occur with meteors because they're going through the atmosphere and they're burning up, leaving a fiery trail. No fiery trails. What are these strange pulses of light? There's an area referred to as the Aristarchus crater. This crater is infamous for translunar phenomena. In fact, it's so infamous for this, it's gotten the nickname the Blue Gem by astronomers, not by me. They call it this because so many blue glows, blue flashes, and blue lights have been seen there that the crater has earned this strange nickname of being the Blue Gem.
Has anyone been able to get a hold of high-res images of that area to take a look to see if there's a dome or some kind of a structure-looking thing in that area?
We do have good images of Aristarchus crater. How good they are, they're high resolution, but how good they are is, these are difficult questions because our sources for these images are government, NASA. And NASA has been accused repeatedly, and there's some good evidence to support the idea that these things out. In fact, some of the photos I looked at clearly show signs of airbrushing. I looked at it on the pixelated level, and it's clearly replicated other areas in some of the photos. So although we don't see anything in Aristarchus crater in the form of these photographs, and these photographs can be highly suspect because of that NASA problem, we do have astronomers, bona fide astronomers at different observatories around the Earth independently observing events in the Aristarchus crater. There's been blue mists, for instance. There's been even in Apollo 11, they saw a sparkling glow while they were orbiting the moon in the area where they were going to land. And so there are strange phenomena on the moon, which again we can't account for because the moon's a dead world, volcanoes, no atmosphere. How do you account for this stuff?
I can't. That's what makes a good conspiracy.
Well, see, I can by coming up with an answer. You know, Occam's razor says the best answer is the simplest one, the one that requires the least explanation and support for it, in the sense of being elaborate. And Occam's razor clearly points to the idea of terrestrials, and they are on the moon. If we didn't use that explanation, we have to come up with all sorts of scientific ones that we don't have the science for yet. We can't explain lightning on the moon, then some phenomena is going on that we don't understand yet there. If there are flashes and blinks on the moon and things crawling across the surface, then there's some scientific phenomena going on that we don't understand yet. And yet, if you say extraterrestrials, it explains it all. Occam's right.
Well, the other option is to just ignore it.
And they do that too. Science is very good at ignoring things. Science is deathly afraid of the third rail. Inconvenient and dangerous to them. You have never seen an astronomer or scientist get for UFO research. Whether UFOs are real or not, and I think they are real, so many millions of people have seen it. So many people report it, and I've investigated a number of these reports as a MUFON field investigator, that it creates an incredible social phenomenon. Why is nobody researching this as a social phenomenon? Even if you don't believe UFOs are real, millions around the world do, is a strange social phenomenon. Why is no one investigating that as a sociologist? They aren't.
Yeah, I don't know. I was talking to someone the other day, and they suggested that we've been going back and forth to the moon in recent times, like humans have been going to the moon and interacting with extraterrestrials there, and the travel time is within minutes. Have you heard anything to that effect, and what do you think of that idea?
Yes, I've read a lot on that, actually. Supposedly the Star Wars program initiated by President Reagan was the start of it, and that some are claiming that we have a secret space fleet. It may not be of it. Is there evidence for this? A little bit. The military, which launched that mini space shuttle that was a drone, and it doesn't have anyone flying it, it was up there over a year. We have no idea what it was doing, why it was there so long, or what that was all about. So, and we do know there's a lot of satellites in orbit that we don't know exist, and we don't know what they're doing. So if this stuff could exist, yes, it's possible other stuff could as well. Then others claim that our technology exploded in the last 50 years, and it has. The sum total of human knowledge in 1957, I think it was, to that point took all of recorded history to reach that point. Now we're doubling the sum total of human knowledge in a matter of months or less. And that's an incredible explosion of technology. And how do we account for it? Did we just reach a takeoff point, or are we getting help?
Well, do you believe that Roswell occurred, and could we be back engineering technology that we found in that ship and using it for different applications?
Yes, and there was another case, another crash in New Mexico as well, and that's an even more famous one. It's called the Aztec Encounter, and I spoke to the two researchers who dealt with it. They've been working on that for over 35 years. They've compiled 55,000 documents, not made up ones, but government documents on this, and they've researched the area repeatedly themselves. Something happened there as well, and it may have been more significant than what happened at Roswell.
I'm going to have to do some research on that one.
I have the book if you'd like me to send it to you.
Do you think that and we'll go with the we went to the moon theory, that when we went to the moon, that the actual moon landings were stopped, that we decided to not pursue going to the moon because we did have contact with these extraterrestrials, and we decided to either take the program secret, like we were just talking about before, or we decided that, they basically kicked us off the moon.
I think we've been warned off the moon. I think I think there's a lot of evidence to support the idea. The fact that it's been about 50 years since anyone ever landed on the moon. Why was it such a big deal in the 50s and 60s to get someone on the moon? And then after several visits, we just suddenly stopped. I can understand America stopping. I can't understand France, Germany, England, Russia, China, all doing the same. No one tried to go to the moon after America did. We're the only ones who ever went there and landed there with living people. And yes, I really think that did happen. And the problem is, because we can see photographs of the landers on the moon, we could bounce lasers off the mirror the astronauts left behind. We saw them setting up on the moon, and how else would those have gotten there? We see the American flag on the moon. How else would that have gotten there? Someone had to put that thing up. But yes, I think we've been warned off, definitely.
And I think we've been warned off Mars, to be honest, even though they're wanting to send more stuff there, and there's the private firm that wants to send a ship up there. But I think that the multiple rovers that we've sent there that have been knocked out of orbit or crash landed, not accidental, that they were intentionally taken out.
Well, you're correct. Mars has had the most failures of any program with regard to sending probes and satellites into orbit around it, both us and Europe, and others as well, Russians and even the Indians. Were trying to send something to Mars and it failed. It seems we have an awful lot of problems when we send stuff to Mars, but we don't have the same problems when we send it to Venus or to Jupiter or Saturn or even the asteroid Ceres, for example. We can't quite understand why it's so common, but there is a high ratio of failures, no doubt.
But of all of the planets, as you said earlier, Mars was the one that was most capable of supporting life, and there are a number of people, myself included, that believe that there was an extraterrestrial civilization on Mars at one point in time, and whether they're there now or not, is a different conversation. But if they are there now and they want to be left alone, I could see where they would take the rovers out.
Well, it's quite theoretically possible there could be life on Mars. It would have to be below the surface at this point. But we know there's water on Mars. There is certainly enough air, not breathable air, but air that they could manufacture breathable air from. Carbon dioxide breaks down into carbon and oxygen. So there's no problem there. There is nitrogen on Mars. So yeah, I don't see that we couldn't have life below ground on Mars. We know there's sometimes free running water on Mars, so there's water. Was Mars more favorable for life earlier on in history? Absolutely. It probably was very Earth-like at one time. Was it that way long enough to achieve intelligent life? I'm not sure, but it could well have.
Well, actually, something, we're talking about these anomalies, and so for March, it was within 2 million years of the formation of Mars that they entered into that Nokian period, which was the most Earth-like period on Mars. 2 million years. That's it.
That's
and then
fast.
It went away. Yeah, and it's like, and which is yet another thing they can't explain, is how it could have gone from this new formation into this life-supporting environment.
Well, their argument is Mars is too small to maintain its activity. It was also too small to keep a liquid core like Earth has now, and with the magnetic field ceased around Mars to protect it, then the solar winds blew the atmosphere away and desiccated the planet. Now that's a reasonable assumption, and yes, it would take a great deal of time, but even so, Mars should have been a viable planet for a very long time before that occurred.
Several billion years.
I would guess at least 2, yeah. Depending on who you listen to, of course.
Well, you should listen to me because I know everything.
Gee, I thought that was me.
Well, together we know everything.
We can conquer the universe.
So I'm taking from how you're speaking that you don't think that President Obama was part of some secret space mission to Mars and um, et cetera,
Uh,
et cetera.
I have learned the hard way to keep an open mind after my Hollow Moon fiasco. I even give some credence to the idea of the Hubble idea. Again, I think it's caverns or something, but uh, I think you have to be very careful about saying it's impossible or never, because, given enough, one of them's bound to be true. And if we are consorting with the aliens from outer space, there's no reason we couldn't avail ourselves of their technology if they're allowing us to. We may be riding on their ships, as it were. But you have to consider that the United States, shortly after the Roswell incident and the Aztec event, suddenly Bell Laboratories developed the transistor. We all think of Japan as being the ones who developed the transistor, but no, they're the ones who made all the nice little cheap radios with it. But we developed the transistor, and then the microchip followed. I remember in high school my science geologist teacher saying we could never have computers that could talk because they would have to be as big as a city block. 2 years later, the microchip came out, and all bets were off. This is how fast our technology is changing. What was ever and impossible 2 years before suddenly was not only possible but happening.
I remember going to the NASA installment in Houston and walk around, and other than most of it was kind of lame, geared for kids. But they had a Saturn V rocket out there, and it was broke up into its stages, so you could kind of look in between the stages. And
Yes.
I mean, I was a electromechanical designer, and I'm looking at these PC boards, and they had these giant resistors and giant capacitors on, and I'm like, they went to the moon with that?
Well, the
And
computers on board Apollo 11 were said to have been about the computing capacity of our average handheld calculator now. Isn't that amazing? They went to the moon with a handheld calculator, basically.
it is amazing.
It is amazing. It's scary. Very scary. They could do it under such primitive conditions. And we now have all this technology and could do it so much easier. Again, the question arises, why haven't we?
Well, role do you think the government has in this? I mean, you've been talking about them covering up the images from the moon, covering up obviously incidents like Roswell, Aztec. What's in it for them? I mean, is it just keeping the technology for ourselves?
I'm sure that's an aspect of it. If we have some kind of agreement with an alien culture where we do what they want us to do and in return we get technology, that would be, with our military-industrial complex being so powerful, I could see that being a really good reason for a cover-up. Another reason for the cover-up, the government can't do anything about it. It has formed some kind of agreement with the aliens where they can do what they want, basically, and they will help to cover it up, the government, because they can't stop it. They just want us to have a normal life. I mean, when the Europeans invaded the Americas, the American civilizations promptly collapsed. And maybe our government is afraid of that and trying to keep that from happening with us. Or it could be they're in collusion. That's the third option, active collusion. If that's the case, it's not good.
No, it's not good, but it also gives merit to some of those other theories that are out there that, there's this group of reptilians that are controlling the government and blah, 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 which to me is you take weird and then move it into the whole like really scary science fiction horror narrative that we go through our daily lives, and we truly would be living in the matrix because our connection to what reality is so disassociated.
So disconnected, yes. Where ignorance is bliss, a little knowledge, dangerous thing. It would be the adage there, I think. There is evidence something bad is going on. The number of researchers who have died over the last 30 years or so is phenomenal. Many of them, oddly, are microbiologists, and they have died under the strangest circumstances. One, for instance, I think it was in New Zealand or maybe Australia, down near Geelong, I think it was. He died suffocating in an airlock in his own laboratory. Air fail-safes. How did he do this? Others have put robotics, driven cars and driven away from trees. Others have jumped bridges. 2 jumped off the same bridge in a matter of months. What is this? 500 researchers have died? This is an incredible number, and under the strange, and also some authors as well. And no one can account for why there's so high a ratio. When you compare them to the standard population of scientists, it's abnormally high. It's statistically beyond the norm. And how do you account for that as well, unless someone is bumping these people off? Oh, and by the way, the number of ones that are dying who have associated some way with UFOs, the UFO phenomena, is higher than the average as well.
Any area, you know, there's someone that's been posting the number of people that talk about alternative health and cancer cures. There, I think it's up to like 8 or 10 different people that have done the last 3 months. I mean, in Michigan, where they have that bad water stuff going on, there were 2 people that testified that were, and I don't remember their exact positions, but they were very involved in getting that information put forward. They both died. You know,
yes,
it's endemic.
It is endemic, and again, when you run the statistical analyses on these, they're abnormally high. Why is that? By the way, the number of people who permanently disappear from this planet every year is incredibly high. In America alone, it comes to around 50,000 a year who permanently disappear. It's over 1 million a year who disappear. But if you discount children who run away from home and are found, or people who are murdered and buried in the shrubs somewhere, or people who just want to disappear, you still come up with that number. For America alone, around 50,000 a year disappear forever. Australia has a phenomenally high number too, and every country in the world has this problem. The permanently disappeared is also a problem as well. So if there are abductions, some people aren't being returned.
Okay, well, you know what? I think on that note, we are going to wrap this up. Wah, bah, bah. See, now I'll be like going out at night going, okay, but I want to come back. See, it used to be, you know, you drive down like some lonely road and I'd be like checking my watch. Okay, I don't want to have any missing time. You know, now I have to worry about missing time permanently. Ooh, scary. So your book, For the Moon is Hollow and Aliens Rule the Sky, I mean, if we send them to Amazon, is that the best place? Or your website, or where do we want to send them?
They can go to robshelsky.blogspot.com and click on the links there for it. But my advice is just go to Amazon and under Kindle search, or Amazon books, search my last name, Shelsky, and every book I own will come up. And a few that aren't mine.
So don't buy those.
Don't buy those.
Well, you've been a pleasure, but we need to wrap it up, okay?
Yes, thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well,
I really enjoyed it.
Well, I really enjoyed it too. That's Rob Shelsky. His book is For the Moon is Hollow and Aliens Rule the Sky.